The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy downtown street as thousands of people hurried past the same corner they saw every day. Most kept their eyes forward, focused on their phones or lost in their own thoughts. Few noticed the weathered man sitting quietly against the brick wall of the old bank building. James Mitchell had been sitting in that same spot for 3 months now. His clothes were clean but worn thin from countless washings in public restrooms. A small cardboard sign rested against his knee, written in careful block letters, "Homeless veteran. Anything helps. God bless." Beside him sat a faded green duffel bag that contained everything he owned in the world. At 62 years old, James had served his country for 23 years in the United States Army. He had been deployed to Vietnam, Kuwait, and Afghanistan. His chest once bore ribbons and medals that told stories of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to his fellow soldiers and his nation. Now, those same decorations lay buried somewhere in that duffel bag, wrapped carefully in an old t-shirt. The path that led James to this street corner had been a winding and painful one. After retiring from the military with full honors, he had struggled to adjust to civilian life. The nightmares came first, then the sleepless nights. The Department of Veterans Affairs had tried to help, but the system was overwhelmed and understaffed. James fell through the cracks that so many veterans before him had fallen through. His wife of 30 years, Sarah, had tried to understand. She had watched the man she married slowly disappear, replaced by someone who jumped at loud noises and couldn't sleep without checking the locks on the doors 3 times. The medication helped sometimes, but it also made him feel like a stranger in his own body. When Sarah was diagnosed with cancer 2 years after his retirement, James threw himself into caring for her, pushing his own struggles aside. The medical bills mounted quickly. Even with his military benefits, the experimental treatments Sarah needed weren't fully covered. James took out a second mortgage on their home, then maxed out their credit cards. He sold his truck, his tools, and anything else of value they owned. Sarah fought bravely for 18 months, but the cancer was stronger. After Sarah's funeral, James found himself alone in a house that felt impossibly empty. The medical debt collectors called daily. The bank sent notices about the mortgage. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket that he couldn't shake off. He started drinking more than he should, trying to numb the pain that seemed to live in his chest. Within 6 months, the bank had foreclosed on the house. James packed what he could carry into his old military duffel bag and left the rest behind. He had some savings from his military pension, but it wasn't enough for rent and a security deposit in a city where housing costs kept rising. He stayed in cheap motels for a while, but the money ran out faster than he expected. The first night James slept in his car, he told himself it was temporary. He would figure something out in the morning. But days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. When his car was repossessed for missed payments, he found himself truly homeless for the first time in his life. The downtown area had several shelters, but they filled up quickly each night. James often found himself sleeping in doorways, under bridges, or in the corner of the park when the weather was good. He learned which restaurants threw away still good food at closing time and which public restrooms stayed unlocked after hours. Other homeless people in the area had warned him about the best spots to sit if he was going to ask for help. The corner by the bank was good because it had foot traffic, but wasn't so busy that the police bothered you. The morning rush hour was usually the most productive time, when people with jobs were heading to work with coffee in their hands and maybe some spare change in their pockets. James never liked asking for money. In all his years of military service, he had prided himself on being self-sufficient, on taking care of others rather than needing help himself. But hunger and the cold reality of life on the streets had a way of wearing down even the strongest pride. He made his sign and took his place on the sidewalk, just another invisible person in a city full of them. Most days he would collect enough money for a meal and maybe a cup of coffee. People would drop coins into the small cup he kept beside him without making eye contact. Some would nod politely. Others would pretend not to see him at all. James had learned not to take it personally. Everyone had their own struggles, their own problems to worry about. The regulars who walked past his corner every day had become familiar faces, even though none of them knew his name. There was the woman in the business suit who always gave him $1 and a smile on Friday mornings. The construction worker who sometimes brought him a sandwich from the deli across the street. The young mother who would let her small daughter drop coins into his cup. teaching her about kindness to those less fortunate. James tried to stay positive despite his circumstances. He would thank everyone who helped him, whether they gave him money or just acknowledged his existence with a nod. He kept his area clean and never bothered anyone who walked past without stopping. He had served his country with honor, and he tried to represent that service with dignity even in his darkest hour. But there were hard days too. Days when the weather was bitter cold and his joints ached from sleeping on concrete. Days when teenagers would walk by and make cruel comments about lazy homeless people who should get jobs. Days when the police would move him along because someone had complained about his presence. On those days, James would remind himself of the good people he had met, the small kindnesses he had received, and the hope that things might eventually get better. As winter approached, James worried about surviving the cold months ahead. The shelter was often full, and sleeping outside in freezing temperatures was dangerous for someone his age. He had applied for housing assistance, but the waiting lists were long and the bureaucracy was complicated to navigate without a permanent address or reliable access to a phone. Still, every morning James would wake up, fold his small blanket, and make his way to his corner by the bank. He would sit quietly with his sign and his cup, watching the world go by and hoping that today might be the day something changed for the better. The rhythm of city life had become as familiar to James as his own heartbeat. Each morning brought the same parade of faces, the same hurried footsteps, the same careful avoidance of eye contact. He had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether someone might stop to help or would walk past without acknowledgement. Winter was settling in with a vengeance, and the cold concrete beneath him seemed to steal the warmth from his body no matter how many layers he wore. His military-issued jacket, now faded and patched in several places, provided some protection against the wind, but it wasn't enough for the harsh nights ahead. James had started spending more time in the public library during the day, grateful for the warmth and the chance to read newspapers to stay connected with the world beyond the street. The librarians had been kind to him, never asking him to leave as long as he was quiet and respectful. He would sit at one of the back tables, sometimes dozing off in the comfortable chairs, other times writing in a small notebook he had found discarded in a trash can. Writing helped him process his thoughts and memories, giving him a way to work through the complex emotions that came with his current situation. In his notebook, James wrote letters to Sarah that he would never send. He told her about the people he met on the street, about the small acts of kindness that kept his faith in humanity alive, and about how much he missed her guidance and support. Sarah had always been the strong one in their relationship, the one who could see solutions when he only saw problems. He wished she was there to help him figure out how to rebuild his life. The other homeless individuals in the downtown area had become something of a community for James. There was Maria, an elderly woman who had lost her apartment when her landlord sold the building. She knew which churches served free meals on which days and shared this information generously. There was Tommy, a young man who had aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go and no family to turn to. And there was Frank, another veteran from the Iraq War who struggled with injuries both visible and invisible. Frank had become something of a friend to James. They would sit together sometimes in the evening, sharing stories about their military service and the challenges of adjusting to civilian life. Frank was younger, in his early 40s, but he understood the particular struggles that veterans faced when trying to navigate the complex systems designed to help them. Both men had fallen through gaps in the safety net that was supposed to catch those who had served their country. The conversations with Frank helped James realize that his situation wasn't unique or entirely his fault. The transition from military to civilian life was difficult for many veterans, especially those who had served in combat zones. The skills that made them effective soldiers didn't always translate easily to the civilian job market. The structure and clear hierarchy of military life was replaced by a confusing maze of civilian bureaucracy and unwritten social rules. Frank had been on the streets for almost 2 years. He had tried several times to get back on his feet, staying in transitional housing programs and working temporary jobs, but something always seemed to go wrong. A bureaucratic mix-up would cause his benefits to be delayed. A potential employer would decide not to hire him when they learned about his homeless status. An unexpected medical issue would derail his carefully laid plans. Despite these setbacks, Frank maintained an optimistic outlook that James found inspiring. He talked about programs he had heard about, organizations that specifically helped veterans, and success stories of other homeless veterans who had managed to rebuild their lives. Frank's hope was contagious, and it helped James believe that his current situation might not be permanent. One particularly cold Thursday morning, James noticed something different about the usual crowd of pedestrians. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, people talking on their phones with animated voices, clusters of individuals gathered around smartphones watching something intently. He couldn't hear what they were discussing, but whatever it was seemed to be big news. A woman in a red coat stopped near his corner, talking loudly into her phone. "I can't believe it," she was saying. "A four-star general, just walking down the street like any regular person. My cousin works at the Pentagon and she says he's legendary, served in every major conflict for the past 30 years. James felt a flutter of interest. A four-star general was indeed a rare sight in civilian settings. These were the highest-ranking officers in the military, individuals who commanded hundreds of thousands of troops and advised presidents on matters of national security. James had only seen a few four-star generals during his career, usually from a distance during formal ceremonies or inspections. As the morning progressed, more people seemed to be talking about this general. Someone mentioned that he was in town for a veterans conference at the convention center a few blocks away. Another person said they had heard he was planning to visit several veteran-related organizations while he was in the city. James found himself thinking about his own military service, remembering the pride he had felt wearing the uniform, the sense of purpose that came with serving something larger than himself. Those memories seemed like they belonged to a different person, someone who lived in a different world than the cold concrete corner where he now spent his days. The lunch crowd brought its usual mix of office workers and tourists. James received a few dollars from passers-by, enough to buy a sandwich and a cup of coffee from the deli across the street. The warm food helped chase away some of the chill that had settled deep in his bones, and the caffeine gave him enough energy to stay alert through the afternoon. As the day wore on, James noticed an increase in military personnel walking through the downtown area. Men and women in dress uniforms, some wearing ribbons and medals that indicated distinguished service. It was unusual to see so many service members in one area outside of a military base, and it reinforced that something significant was happening in the city. An older man in a Navy uniform stopped to talk with James briefly. The sailor had noticed James's military bearing and the way he kept his small area organized despite his circumstances. They talked for a few minutes about their respective service experiences, and the sailor left a $20 bill in James's cup before continuing on his way. The conversation reminded James of the camaraderie he had experienced during his military service. There was an unspoken bond between people who had served, a shared understanding of the sacrifices and challenges that came with military life. Even in his current situation, that connection could still spark moments of recognition and mutual respect. As evening approached and the foot traffic began to thin out, James prepared for another night on the streets. The temperature was dropping and the weather forecast called for possible snow overnight. He would need to find a warm place to sleep, possibly in the emergency shelter if there was space available. James packed his few belongings into his duffel bag, folded his cardboard sign, and counted the money he had collected during the day. It had been a better day than most, partly thanks to the generous sailor and a few other kind individuals. He had enough for a hot meal and maybe a cup of coffee to help him stay warm through the early evening hours. As he stood up to leave his corner, James took a moment to look around at the city that had become his home. Despite all the challenges and hardships he faced, he still felt a connection to this place and these people. Tomorrow would bring another day, another chance for things to improve, another opportunity to encounter the unexpected kindness of strangers. Friday morning arrived with a crispness in the air that promised winter was truly settling in. James had managed to get a spot in the emergency shelter the night before, which meant he had slept on an actual cot instead of cold concrete. The shelter was crowded and noisy, but it was warm and safe, and James was grateful for the temporary refuge from the harsh weather. He made his way to his usual corner earlier than normal, wanting to secure his spot before the morning rush began. The city street cleaners had just finished their rounds, leaving the sidewalks temporarily pristine before the day's accumulation of litter and debris would begin again. James set down his duffel bag and arranged his small area with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make the most of very little space. The cardboard sign went up against the brick wall, positioned so it could be easily read by people walking in either direction. His small cup for donations was placed strategically nearby, close enough that people wouldn't have to go out of their way to contribute, but far enough from the sidewalk's main traffic flow that it wouldn't be accidentally kicked by hurried pedestrians. As James settled into position, he noticed that the energy on the street felt different from the previous day. There were more people in military uniforms walking through the area, and several black SUVs with government plates had driven past since he arrived. Whatever event was happening at the convention center was clearly significant enough to warrant increased security and official attention. The morning commuters began their familiar parade past his corner. James recognized many of the faces now, even though most of the people didn't acknowledge his presence. There was the young man in the expensive suit who never made eye contact, but sometimes dropped $1 into the cup. The middle-aged woman who always walked while talking on her phone, gesturing animatedly as she discussed business deals or family drama. The elderly gentleman who walked with a slight limp and always nodded politely when their eyes met. Around 9:30, James noticed a commotion developing further down the street. A small crowd was gathering and people were taking pictures with their phones. He could hear excited voices carrying on the morning air, though he couldn't make out the specific words. Whatever was happening seemed to be moving slowly in his direction. A police officer walked past, speaking into his radio in the clipped, professional tone that James remembered from his own military communications training. The officer glanced at James briefly, not with the suspicious look that James sometimes received from law enforcement, but with the kind of neutral acknowledgement that suggested he was simply cataloging everyone in the area as part of his security sweep. The crowd was definitely moving closer now. James could see that at the center of the attention was a small group of people in military dress uniforms. The uniforms were pristine, with ribbons and insignia that indicated high ranks and distinguished service. Even from a distance, James could tell that these were senior officers, the kind of leaders he had only encountered a few times during his own military career. As the group approached, James began to make out more details. There were several colonels and at least one general, based on the stars visible on their uniforms. They were walking slowly, stopping occasionally to talk with people on the street or to pose for photographs with excited civilians. The entire scene had the feel of an informal public appearance, the kind of community outreach that military leaders sometimes engaged in to connect with the public they served. James felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched the approaching group. Pride in seeing the military represented so professionally and honorably, nostalgia for his own days in uniform, when he had been part of something larger than himself, and a deep sadness about how far he had fallen from those days of purpose and belonging. One of the officers in the group caught James's attention immediately. He was taller than the others, with graying hair and the kind of commanding presence that marked natural leaders. The stars on his uniform indicated that he was a 4-star general, the same rank that people had been talking about the day before. This had to be the legendary officer that the woman in the red coat had mentioned. The general moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge, but James also noticed something else in his demeanor. There was a warmth in the way he interacted with civilians, a genuine interest in the people he met that went beyond mere public relations. When children approached him for autographs, he knelt down to their level to talk with them. When elderly veterans in the crowd stepped forward to shake his hand, he took time to listen to their stories with obvious respect and attention. As the group drew nearer to James's corner, he found himself unsure of how to react. Part of him wanted to remain inconspicuous, to avoid drawing attention to his circumstances in front of such distinguished military leaders. Another part of him felt drawn to acknowledge their presence, to somehow reconnect with the military community that had once been his whole world. The decision was taken out of his hands when the general's eyes swept across the area and came to rest on James. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other across the distance of perhaps 20 feet. James saw the general's gaze take in his worn military jacket, his weathered appearance, and the cardboard sign beside him. Something shifted in the general's expression. The polite public smile faded, replaced by a look of focused attention that James recognized from his own military experience. It was the look of a leader assessing a situation, processing information, and making decisions. The general said something quietly to the officers accompanying him, and the entire group began moving directly toward James's corner. James felt his heart rate increase as the reality of the situation hit him. A 4-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military, was walking directly toward him. James quickly ran through a mental inventory of his appearance, wishing he had been able to shave that morning or that his clothes were in better condition. He straightened his posture instinctively, falling back on decades of military training about how to present yourself to superior officers. The crowd that had been following the general seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. People slowed their walking pace, and many began pointing phones in their direction to record whatever interaction was about to take place. James could hear murmured conversations as people speculated about what they were witnessing. As the general approached, James struggled with whether he should stand up. Military protocol would normally require him to stand and salute when approached by such a high-ranking officer, but his current circumstances made him uncertain about whether such formalities still applied. He was no longer an active duty soldier, and his homeless status complicated the traditional rules of military courtesy. The general was now only a few steps away, and James could see his face clearly. The officer appeared to be in his early 60s with intelligent eyes and the kind of bearing that spoke of decades of leadership responsibility. His uniform was immaculate, with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career spanning multiple conflicts and deployments. James made his decision. Regardless of his current circumstances, he was still a veteran who had served his country with honor. He began to struggle to his feet, his joints protesting after hours of sitting on the cold concrete. As he rose, he straightened to the best approximation of military attention that his weathered body could manage. The general stopped directly in front of him, and the two men faced each other in a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually lasted. James could feel the weight of all the eyes watching them, could sense the cameras recording their interaction, but his focus was entirely on the distinguished officer standing before him. Without saying a word, the general's right hand moved slowly and deliberately to his forehead in a crisp, perfect military salute. The world seemed to stop moving around James as he watched the 4-star general's hand rise to his forehead in that perfect, crisp salute. Time stretched like taffy as James processed what was happening. A general officer, one of the most senior leaders in the entire United States military, was saluting him. Not the other way around, as military protocol would normally dictate, but the general was saluting James. James felt tears begin to well up in his eyes as the full impact of the moment hit him. His own hand moved instinctively to return the salute, muscle memory from decades of military service overriding his shock and disbelief. His weathered fingers found their way to his forehead, and despite the tremor in his hand from cold and emotion, his salute was steady and proud. The two men held their salutes for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. Around them, the street had gone completely quiet. The usual sounds of traffic and conversation seemed muted, as if the entire city was holding its breath to witness this extraordinary moment of recognition and respect. When the general finally lowered his hand, James followed suit, but neither man broke eye contact. The general's expression was serious but warm, filled with the kind of understanding that only came from shared experience. James saw in those eyes the recognition of a fellow warrior, someone who understood the weight of service and the challenges that could follow. "What's your name, soldier?" the general asked, his voice carrying the authority of command but also genuine interest and concern. "James Mitchell, sir," James replied, automatically straightening his posture even further. "Sergeant First Class, retired? 23 years of service." The general nodded slowly as if committing the information to memory. "Where did you serve, Sergeant Mitchell?" "Vietnam, Kuwait, Afghanistan, sir. Multiple deployments to each theater." James's voice grew stronger as he spoke about his service, the pride of those years cutting through the shame of his current circumstances. "Outstanding service record," the general said, and James could tell he meant it. "What unit were you with in Afghanistan?" As James began to describe his deployments and the units he had served with, something remarkable happened. The general listened with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated his genuine interest and extensive knowledge of military operations. Other officers in the general's group joined the conversation, and James found himself surrounded by senior military leaders who were treating him not as a homeless person to be pitied, but as a fellow veteran whose service deserved recognition and respect. The conversation revealed that one of the colonels in the group had served in the same area of Afghanistan where James had been deployed. Though at a different time, they compared notes about the challenges of that particular region, the local population, and the complexities of the mission there. For a few minutes, James felt like he was back in the military community, where his experience and knowledge had value and meaning. The crowd of civilians watching this interaction had grown significantly. People were recording with their phones, and James could hear whispered conversations as bystanders tried to understand what they were witnessing. Some seemed to recognize the significance of a 4-star general, saluting and talking respectfully with a homeless veteran. Others appeared confused by the breach of what they assumed was normal protocol. "Sergeant Mitchell," the general said, pulling a business card from his pocket, "I want you to call this number. These are people who specialize in helping veterans who are facing challenges transitioning back to civilian life. They're good people who understand what you've been through." James accepted the card with hands that shook slightly. Not from cold this time, but from emotion. He looked down at the card and saw that it was for a veterans advocacy organization he had heard of, but never thought to contact. The fact that a 4-star general was personally recommending them gave the organization an instant credibility and importance in James's mind. "Sir, I want you to know that this means more to me than I can express," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been on these streets for months, and most people look right through me like I don't exist. To have you acknowledge my service, to treat me with this respect." The general placed a firm hand on James's shoulder. "Sergeant Mitchell, you served your country with honor for over 2 decades. That service doesn't become less valuable because you're going through hard times now. You earned the respect of every American, including mine, through your dedication and sacrifice." One of the other officers stepped forward and handed James an envelope. "There's information about several programs in there," the officer explained. "Housing assistance, job training, counseling services. Everything you need to know about getting the help you've earned through your service." James accepted the envelope, overwhelmed by the kindness and generosity these officers were showing him. He had gone from being invisible on a street corner to being the focus of attention from some of the most senior military leaders in the country. The contrast was almost too much to process. "I also want to invite you to something," the general continued. "We're having a Veterans Appreciation Ceremony tomorrow evening at the convention center. It's specifically to honor veterans who have served in combat zones. I would be honored if you would attend as my personal guest." James was speechless. The idea of attending a formal military ceremony, especially as the personal guest of a 4-star general, seemed impossible to believe. He looked down at his worn clothes and weathered appearance, then back at the immaculately dressed officers surrounding him. "Sir, I don't think I have appropriate clothing for such an event," James said quietly, embarrassed by his circumstances but not wanting to decline such an incredible invitation. The general smiled. "That's already taken care of. Colonel Henderson here will make sure you have everything you need." He gestured to one of the officers in the group, who nodded and stepped forward to shake James's hand. "We'll get you cleaned up, properly dressed and transported to the ceremony," Colonel Henderson said. "It would be our honor to have you there, Sergeant Mitchell." The general looked around at the crowd that had gathered to watch their interaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice so everyone could hear, "I want you all to meet Sergeant First Class James Mitchell, a true American hero who served our country with distinction for 23 years in some of the most dangerous places on earth. His service in Vietnam, Kuwait, and Afghanistan helped keep all of us safe and free." A spontaneous round of applause erupted from the crowd. People who had walked past James for months without acknowledging his existence were now clapping for him, recognizing him as someone worthy of their respect and admiration. James felt overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of his circumstances. From invisible homeless person to honored veteran in the span of a few minutes. As the applause died down, the general shook James's hand one more time. "Sergeant Mitchell, I need to continue with my schedule, but I want you to know that meeting you has been the highlight of my visit to this city. Your service matters, your life has value, and tomorrow night we're going to celebrate both." The group of officers began to move away, but not before each of them took a moment to shake James's hand and thank him for his service. The colonel who had served in Afghanistan exchanged contact information with James, promising to stay in touch and help however he could. As the military group disappeared down the street, followed by their crowd of admirers and photographers, James found himself alone again on his corner. But everything had changed. The business card and envelope in his hands represented possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine just an hour earlier. More importantly, the respect and recognition he had received from the general and his staff had reminded James of who he really was beneath the circumstances that had brought him to the streets. The rest of Friday passed in a blur of surreal activity that James could hardly believe was real. After the general and his entourage had departed, James remained on his corner for a while, still processing what had just happened. The business card felt warm in his hand, and he read it over and over again to convince himself it wasn't a dream. Word of the encounter spread quickly through the downtown area. People who had witnessed the general's salute began sharing the story with friends and colleagues. Several individuals who had never spoken to James before approached him throughout the day, thanking him for his service and asking about his military experience. Some left donations in his cup, but more importantly, they treated him like a person whose story mattered. A local news reporter arrived around lunchtime. Having heard about the incident through social media posts and eyewitness accounts, she interviewed James about his military service and his current circumstances, treating him with the respect and dignity that had been so rare in his recent experience. James found himself opening up about his journey from decorated veteran to homeless person, sharing details he hadn't told anyone in months. The reporter was particularly interested in the general's decision to salute James and invite him to the veterans ceremony. James explained how meaningful that moment of recognition had been, how it had reminded him that his service had value regardless of his current situation. The reporter seemed genuinely moved by his story and promised that the article would focus on the importance of supporting veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. Late in the afternoon, Colonel Henderson returned as promised. He was accompanied by a staff sergeant who introduced himself as the colonel's aide. They had come to discuss the arrangements for the next evening's ceremony and to ensure that James had everything he needed to attend the formal event. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Henderson said, "we've made arrangements for you to stay at a hotel tonight and tomorrow night. You'll have access to shower facilities, and we've arranged for appropriate dress clothing for the ceremony. We've also scheduled you for a haircut and shave at a barbershop near the hotel." James was overwhelmed by the generosity and attention to detail. The idea of sleeping in an actual bed, taking a hot shower, and getting properly groomed felt like impossible luxuries after months on the street. He tried to express his gratitude, but the words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what these people were doing for him. The staff sergeant handed James a hotel key card and a small envelope containing cash for meals and incidental expenses. "The hotel is about 6 blocks from here," he explained. "The barbershop appointment is tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and we'll pick you up at the hotel at 5:30 for the ceremony." As they prepared to leave, Colonel Henderson paused and looked seriously at James. "Sergeant Mitchell, I want you to understand that this isn't charity. You earned this recognition through your service to our country. Tomorrow night, you'll be sitting with distinguished guests and fellow veterans who understand exactly what you've contributed to America's security and freedom." After the officers departed, James packed his few belongings into his duffel bag and made his way to the hotel. The lobby was elegant and clean, a stark contrast to the shelters and street corners that had been his accommodations for months. The desk clerk, who had obviously been briefed about James's situation, treated him with professional courtesy and provided directions to his room. The hotel room was small but comfortable, with a real bed, clean linens, and a private bathroom with hot water. James stood in the doorway for several minutes, almost afraid to enter, as if crossing the threshold might somehow break the spell and return him to the harsh reality of life on the streets. Finally, he stepped inside and set his duffel bag on the luggage stand. The first thing James did was take a long, hot shower. The warm water felt incredible against his skin, washing away not just the dirt and grime of street life, but also some of the despair and hopelessness that had accumulated over the months. He used the hotel shampoo and soap liberally, enjoying the simple luxury of being completely clean for the first time in weeks. After his shower, James called the phone number on the business card the general had given him. The person who answered was warm and knowledgeable, explaining the various services available to veterans in need. They scheduled an appointment for the following week to discuss housing assistance, job training programs, and healthcare services. For the first time in months, James began to see a concrete path forward from his current circumstances. That evening, James ordered room service and ate his first hot meal in a comfortable setting since becoming homeless. As he ate, he watched the local news and was surprised to see coverage of his encounter with the general earlier that day. The reporter had done an excellent job of telling his story with dignity and respect, focusing on his military service and the challenges that many veterans faced when transitioning to civilian life. The news segment included interviews with other veterans who had struggled with similar issues, and it highlighted several organizations that provided assistance to former service members in need. James was struck by how many other people had faced similar challenges and how many resources were available that he hadn't known about during his darkest moments. Saturday morning brought a sense of anticipation and nervous energy that James hadn't felt in a long time. He woke up in the comfortable hotel bed feeling more rested than he had in months. After another hot shower and a room service breakfast, he spent time reviewing the information packet that Colonel Henderson had given him. The packet contained details about various veterans assistance programs, including housing vouchers, job placement services, and mental health support. There were contact numbers for caseworkers who specialized in helping veterans navigate the complex bureaucracy of benefits and services. Most importantly, there were success stories of other veterans who had overcome homelessness and rebuilt their lives. At 2 o'clock, James arrived at the barber shop for his appointment. The barber was an older gentleman who had served in the Navy during the Korean War. As he cut James's hair and gave him a professional shave, they talked about their respective military experiences and the challenges of adjusting to civilian life. The barber refused to accept payment for his services, saying it was his honor to help a fellow veteran prepare for such an important occasion. When James looked in the mirror after the haircut and shave, he was amazed by the transformation. The man looking back at him looked dignified and professional, more like the respected sergeant he had been than the homeless person he had become. The change in his appearance helped restore some of the confidence and self-respect that had been eroded by months of hardship. Back at the hotel, James found that the promised dress clothes had been delivered to his room. The suit was well-tailored and appropriate for a formal military ceremony. There was also a new dress shirt, tie, and polished shoes that fit perfectly. Someone had clearly taken great care to ensure that everything was exactly right for the evening's event. As James dressed for the ceremony, he thought about how dramatically his life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he had been an invisible homeless person sitting on a street corner. Tonight, he would be attending a formal Veterans Appreciation ceremony as the personal guest of a 4-star general. The transformation seemed impossible, but it was happening. The most remarkable thing about the entire experience was how it had reminded James of his own worth and dignity. The general's salute had been more than just a gesture of respect. It had been a recognition of James's inherent value as a human being and as a veteran who had served his country with honor. That recognition had begun to heal wounds that James hadn't even realized were still bleeding. At 5:15, James was ready and waiting in the hotel lobby when Colonel Henderson arrived to escort him to the ceremony. The colonel smiled broadly when he saw James's transformation and complimented him on his appearance. As they walked to the waiting car, James stood straighter and walked with more confidence than he had in months, ready to reclaim his place in the community of veterans who had served their country with pride and distinction. The convention center had been transformed into an elegant venue for the Veterans Appreciation ceremony. Red, white, and blue bunting decorated the walls, and large American flags flanked the stage where distinguished speakers would address the assembled guests. Round tables filled the main hall, each adorned with centerpieces featuring small American flags and military insignia from all branches of service. James walked into the venue alongside Colonel Henderson, still somewhat in disbelief that he was actually there. The other attendees were a mix of active-duty military personnel, veterans from various eras, local dignitaries, and family members. Everyone was dressed formally, and the atmosphere was one of reverence and celebration for those who had served their country. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Henderson said as they approached the registration table, "you'll be seated at the head table with General Morrison and other distinguished guests." The general specifically requested that you sit beside him tonight. James felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of sitting at the head table with such important people. He had attended military ceremonies before, but always as part of the general attendee population, never as an honored guest. The colonel seemed to sense his apprehension and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You belong here just as much as anyone else in this room," the colonel said quietly. "Your 23 years of service, your deployments to combat zones, your sacrifices for this country. Those accomplishments speak for themselves. Don't let your recent circumstances make you forget who you really are." As they made their way toward the head table, James was stopped several times by other veterans who had heard about his encounter with the general the day before. Word had spread quickly through the veteran community, and many wanted to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Some shared their own stories of difficult times after leaving the military, creating an instant bond of understanding and mutual support. One elderly veteran, who introduced himself as a World War II survivor of the Battle of the Bulge, gripped James's hand firmly and looked directly into his eyes. "Son," he said, "I've been homeless myself. Lost everything after the war, couldn't find work, couldn't adjust to civilian life. Took me years to get back on my feet. But look at me now. I've got grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a good life. Things can turn around when you least expect it." Another veteran, a woman who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, told James about her own struggles with PTSD and homelessness after her discharge. She had eventually found help through veteran services and now worked as a counselor, helping other veterans navigate similar challenges. She gave James her business card and encouraged him to call her the following week. These conversations reminded James that he wasn't alone in his struggles. The challenges he had faced were part of a larger pattern that affected many veterans, and there were people who understood exactly what he had been through. More importantly, there were examples of people who had overcome these challenges and built successful, meaningful lives. General Morrison arrived at the convention center to a standing ovation from the assembled guests. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a natural leader, stopping to talk with veterans and their families, posing for photographs, and clearly enjoying the opportunity to connect with the people he had spent his career serving alongside. When the general reached the head table, he immediately sought out James and greeted him warmly. "Sergeant Mitchell, you look outstanding tonight. I'm so glad you could join us for this celebration." As they took their seats at the head table, the general introduced James to the other distinguished guests, including a Medal of Honor recipient, several retired generals and admirals, and a former Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Each introduction was accompanied by a brief mention of James's service record, and every person at the table treated him with the same respect and courtesy they showed each other. The ceremony began with a color guard presentation and the playing of the national anthem. James felt tears come to his eyes as he stood with his hand over his heart, surrounded by hundreds of other veterans doing the same. The simple ritual connected him to something larger than his individual struggles, reminding him of the shared values and common cause that had motivated his decades of service. The evening's program included several speakers who talked about the importance of supporting veterans and ensuring that their service was properly recognized and rewarded. A local congressman spoke about pending legislation to improve veterans' benefits and services. A representative from a major corporation discussed their veterans' hiring initiatives. Each speaker emphasized that veterans had earned the right to live with dignity and security after their service ended. When General Morrison took the stage to deliver the keynote address, he began by acknowledging the various veterans in attendance and thanking them for their continued dedication to their fellow service members. Then he did something unexpected. He called James up to the stage to join him. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general said as James made his way to the podium, "yesterday I had the honor of meeting Sergeant First Class James Mitchell on a downtown street corner. Sergeant Mitchell served our country for 23 years, including multiple deployments to Vietnam, Kuwait, and Afghanistan. Like too many of our veterans, he has faced challenges in transitioning to civilian life that led to him experiencing homelessness." The audience was completely silent as the general continued. "But I want you to understand something important about Sergeant Mitchell and veterans like him. His current circumstances do not diminish the value of his service or his worth as a human being. When I saw him yesterday, I didn't see a homeless person to be pitied. I saw a fellow warrior who had given decades of his life to protecting our freedom and security." James stood beside the general, overwhelmed by the public recognition and the powerful words being spoken on his behalf. The general's speech was not just about James personally, but about the broader obligation that society had to support all veterans who had served their country with honor. "That's why I saluted Sergeant Mitchell yesterday," the general continued. "And that's why he's here with us tonight as my personal guest. Because we never leave a soldier behind, whether on the battlefield or on the streets of our own cities. Sergeant Mitchell's service matters just as much today as it did when he was wearing the uniform, and our commitment to him and all our veterans must be just as strong." The general turned to James and extended his hand. "Sergeant Mitchell, on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your service, your sacrifice, and your example. You represent the very best of what it means to be an American soldier." The standing ovation that followed was thunderous and sustained. James shook the general's hand while fighting back tears, overwhelmed by the recognition and support being shown to him. As he looked out at the audience of fellow veterans, he saw many people wiping their eyes and nodding in understanding and agreement. When James returned to his seat, he was approached by several people who wanted to talk with him about opportunities for assistance and support. A representative from a veteran housing organization offered him a place in their transitional housing program. A local business owner discussed potential employment opportunities. A counselor from the VA explained new programs designed specifically for homeless veterans. For the first time in months, James began to see concrete possibilities for rebuilding his life. The recognition and respect he had received over the past 2 days had restored his confidence and reminded him that he had valuable skills and experience to offer. More importantly, he had been connected with a network of people who understood his challenges and were committed to helping him overcome them. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to mingle and say their goodbyes, James reflected on the incredible journey of the past 48 hours. He had gone from being invisible and forgotten to being recognized and celebrated by some of the most distinguished people in the military community. The experience had reminded him that every person has value and dignity, regardless of their current circumstances, and that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see and acknowledge that worth to begin a transformation. 6 months later, James Mitchell stood in front of the mirror in his small but comfortable apartment, adjusting his tie before heading to work. The reflection looking back at him was dramatically different from the weathered, hopeless man who had sat on that downtown street corner just half a year earlier. His eyes held a brightness and sense of purpose that had been missing for years, and his posture spoke of someone who had reclaimed his dignity and self-worth. The apartment was modest, but it was his own. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room that he had furnished gradually with help from various veteran assistance programs. On the wall hung his military commendations, finally unpacked from that old duffel bag and displayed with the pride they deserved. Photographs from his years of service sat on a bookshelf, alongside pictures from recent gatherings with his new community of veteran friends and supporters. The transformation in James's life had begun immediately after the veterans ceremony. The housing assistance program had placed him in transitional housing within a week, giving him a stable base from which to rebuild. The job placement service had worked with him to translate his military skills into civilian terms, helping him land a position with a nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless veterans. James's work had become more than just a job. It had become a mission. Every day he used his own experience of homelessness and recovery to help other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. He understood their shame, their feelings of abandonment, and their difficulty navigating civilian systems in ways that people who hadn't lived through those experiences simply couldn't comprehend. His first client had been Frank, the young veteran who had befriended James during his time on the streets. James had immediately thought of Frank after getting settled in his transitional housing, and he had gone back to the downtown area to find him. Using the resources and connections he had gained through his encounter with General Morrison, James was able to help Frank access housing and mental health services that began to address the trauma that had kept him trapped in cycles of instability. The success with Frank had led to other referrals and opportunities to help. James found that his credibility with homeless veterans was instant and powerful because he had been where they were. They trusted him in ways they didn't trust social workers or counselors who had never experienced the daily humiliation and desperation of life on the streets. When James told them that recovery was possible, They believed him because he was living proof. The work wasn't always easy. James encountered veterans whose situations were complicated by addiction, mental illness, criminal records, or other factors that made their path to stability more difficult. He learned that not every story had a happy ending, and that sometimes the best he could do was provide temporary relief and connection rather than permanent solutions. But even the small victories felt meaningful and worthwhile. James had also begun speaking at events and conferences about veteran homelessness and the importance of recognizing the inherent dignity of every person, regardless of their circumstances. His story had resonated with audiences because it challenged assumptions about homeless people and demonstrated the potential for transformation when individuals are treated with respect and given appropriate support. One particularly meaningful speaking engagement had been at a military academy, where James talked to future officers about their responsibilities to the soldiers they would command, not just during their active service but throughout their lives. He emphasized that leadership meant caring for people as whole human beings, understanding that military service could have lasting effects on individuals long after they left the uniform behind. The relationship with General Morrison had continued beyond that initial encounter. The general had become something of a mentor to James, offering guidance and support as he navigated his new career in veteran services. They met for coffee every few months, and the general often sought James's input on policies and programs related to veteran homelessness and support services. General Morrison had also nominated James for several awards recognizing his work with homeless veterans. James had received a Community Service Award from the mayor's office and had been recognized by the State Veterans Department for his contributions to veteran welfare. Each recognition felt surreal to someone who had been invisible and forgotten just months earlier. Perhaps most importantly, James had begun to rebuild his personal relationships and social connections. The isolation and shame of homelessness had cut him off from friends and acquaintances from his military years, but his recovery had allowed him to reconnect with some of those relationships. He had joined a veterans motorcycle club and had begun attending regular social gatherings with other former service members. James had also begun the process of working through his grief over Sarah's death and his own struggles with depression and trauma. The counseling services provided through the VA had helped him understand that his homelessness wasn't a moral failing, but rather the result of multiple factors that had overwhelmed his ability to cope. Understanding this had been crucial to rebuilding his self-esteem and sense of worth. On this particular morning, James was preparing for a special event. The nonprofit organization where he worked was hosting a fundraising breakfast, and General Morrison would be the keynote speaker. James had been asked to introduce the general and to share his own story as an example of the work the organization did and the impact it could have on individual lives. As James walked to the event venue, he passed the street corner where he had spent so many difficult months. He paused for a moment, looking at the spot where he had sat with his cardboard sign and his cup for donations. The corner looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than it had when it represented his entire world. A new person was sitting there now, a middle-aged woman with a sign asking for help. James approached her carefully, not wanting to intrude or make assumptions about her situation. After a brief conversation, he learned that she was a veteran who had recently lost her housing due to unexpected medical bills. James gave her his business card and explained the services his organization could provide. "I know it's hard to believe right now," James told her, "but your situation can change. 6 months ago, I was sitting in this exact same spot, feeling hopeless and forgotten. Today, I'm on my way to work helping other veterans, and tonight I'll be sleeping in my own apartment. Let me help you take the first steps toward getting your life back." The woman looked at James skeptically, as he had looked at offers of help during his own time on the streets. But something in his eyes, some combination of understanding and genuine hope, seemed to register with her. She accepted his card and promised to call the number on it later that day. As James continued toward the fundraising event, he reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him from that street corner to where he was today. The encounter with General Morrison had been the catalyst, but the real work of rebuilding his life had required sustained effort, support from many people, and a willingness to believe that change was possible even when it seemed impossible. At the event, James stood at the podium and looked out at an audience of donors, volunteers and community leaders who supported veteran services. Many faces in the crowd were familiar now, people who had become part of his extended network of support and friendship. General Morrison sat in the front row, smiling encouragingly. 6 months ago, James began, I was homeless, sitting on a downtown street corner, feeling invisible and forgotten. I thought my life was over, that I had lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to contribute to the world. Then something extraordinary happened that changed everything. As James told his story, he emphasized not just the transformation in his own life, but the broader lessons about human dignity, the power of recognition and respect, and the potential for recovery that exists in every person, regardless of their current circumstances. He talked about the veterans he now worked with daily, each with their own story of struggle and their own potential for renewal. General Morrison's salute didn't just acknowledge my military service, James concluded. It reminded me that I was still a human being worthy of respect and capable of contributing to my community. That recognition gave me back my hope and my sense of purpose. Today, I have the privilege of passing that gift along to other veterans who are where I was just 6 months ago, helping them remember who they really are, beneath whatever circumstances have brought them to our doors. The standing ovation that followed felt different from the one at the veterans ceremony 6 months earlier. This time, James wasn't overwhelmed by the recognition. He was energized by it. He knew that this applause represented not just appreciation for his personal journey, but support for the ongoing work of helping other veterans rebuild their lives and reclaim their place in the community they had served so faithfully.